All right, what is up, everybody, and welcome back to the Launchpad podcast. It is your host, Gabriel Hardy, of course, and in this episode today, I had on my buddy Brad, who works with me at the company Minnesota Nice Ethnobotanicals, and he's doing a lot of interesting research right now into some of the alkaloids found within Amanita Muscaria, and so we have some cool information to share with you guys. And of course, Brad also kind of shares his personal experience with Amanita Muscaria. We, get into the rabbit hole of sort of like the history of Amanita Muscaria and the links between that and like early Christianity. It was a very interesting conversation. And you might have noticed that here recently I've been focusing a lot on Amanita Muscaria, and it's for a reason. I do think that this is a very magical little mushroom that has massive healing potential for a lot of people, and it is a legal mushroom here in the United States. In every state except for Louisiana, it's legal to buy, possess, and sell. There's nothing pseudo-legal about it. But the issue that we're facing right now is that a lot of people within this market, within this really kind of fast-growing Amanita product market, is that they are selling products that are very low quality and or they're spiked with like research chemical benzodiazepines and tryptamines. And as you can imagine, this is very dangerous, and it's very unfortunate because what they're doing is they're bastardizing and jeopardizing a mushroom and the sort of legality of it. A mushroom that has a lot of healing potential, like I just said. And I'm not going to, unpack all why it's so healing and stuff right now, because that's sort of what this episode is about. But if you would like to try some Amanita products for yourself, the highest quality products on the market, then I highly recommend that you go down to our website, be in the link in the description or whatever you're watching this on, Minnesota Nice, ethnobotanicals.com. And if you use the code Amanita Ninja, just one word, all caps, Amanita Ninja, you'll get 10% off your order. And of course, I will receive a commission. So, yeah, peace out. Much love, everybody.
Merging with simulator in 3, 2, 1.
It's pretty spectacular, the sort of like lists that we're putting together of what it seems like this mushroom's good for. Like, obviously, the big ones that we kind of educate everybody about and people are generally educated about is like sleep, anxiety, things like that. But then we're finding some people seem to do really good on like a high ibotenic acid mix for like focus and things. Some people prefer ibotenic acid in their just experiences in general. And then like we have, of course we're not medical doctors. This is not medical advice, all of that shit. But, we have people who are customers of ours who are anecdotally yeah, people who are customers of ours who are anecdotally reporting some pretty spectacular things. Could you talk about some of those things?
Yeah, regarding the glutamate, Christian at MN Botanicals, loves that element there, and, the three compounds are ibotenic acid, muscimol, muscarine, ibotenic acid. And yeah, as we look into these compounds, we're realizing that they are direct neurotransmitter agonists, all found in one place, so you've got ibotenic acid being the glutamate agonist, and then muscimol being a GABA A receptor agonist, and then muscarine being an acetylcholine muscarinic receptor agonist. And, they're not, acting on, surrounding receptors and channels. They actually bind directly to the receptor. So as far as the body's concerned, the body sees them as being an endogenous neurotransmitter, right? So it's really fascinating that all three of these are in the one fungi. And, typically ibotenic acid, I certainly think it has its place for some applications. And then other applications, when you look at the way these receptors work, typically they will define glutamate as being excitatory and muscimol being a GABA inhibitory. So they kind of are competing, in the body. Mm-hmm. So, and then glutamate is naturally decarboxylated into muscimol, the GABA component, by drying in the body. There's other methods. So it kind of wants to be a GABA, receptor agonist. It's interesting. And then, you get into situations like, in terms of like applications of the three, right now I've got a friend, she's been using the spray that I developed, which is, I've decarboxylated all the ibotenic acid to muscimol. So it's just muscimol and muscarine. So you're going to have your GABA and your muscarinic activity, and there's a lot of science around how they are. Basically, there's an entourage of the two, like being co-transmitted into neural clefts and performing various activities. And then I've got a friend here who uses a spray to help her relax and be focused. And she's got an ex-husband who she's caregiving for. He's got Parkinson's. We're finding that's having some good results for tremors in his walking. And when you look at, do the Parkinson's research, it looks like Parkinson's is due to dopamine levels dropping. Well, then what the body does is it tries to increase glutamate. That's going to give him, the ataxia and the problem walking. So whatever we're doing, it's diminishing, it seems like, the glutamate activity, which is causing the problem. So, an excitation for someone looking to, have hyper awareness is good for that. But someone who's trying to counter that, like with tremors, it doesn't work there. So it's kind of interesting how, we're beginning to learn about these things, and we can create formulations based around, different effects of the various components in there.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really funny to me to watch all of this unfold because it comes back to a thing that you mentioned like right at the beginning of the podcast, and that is this sort of like modernized, westernized version of medicine that you see commonly practice of chasing symptoms and throwing pills at things. And it's a lot of these pills and a lot of these compounds do stem, like their origins stem from research done on plants and things like that, and things that they've isolated and tweaked. And it's funny to see that very common correlation of like, okay, once we like kind of isolate things and take things over and make them man-made, there does seem to be quite a few people who have complications. Not that we can't develop something, that is somewhat efficacious for some people, but then when you take something like Amanita that just has nature's intelligence in it, it seems to be much more agreeable with a lot more people. And a lot of the things that you're laying out make sense in terms of like the entourage effect. And it's not just like binding solely super tightly to your GABA receptors. There's also, some muscarine is really interesting to me, man. I on our TikTok pages and social media, I've gone into quite a bit of detail about ibotenic acid and muscimol and that sort of synergy. And that's one that's talked about a lot when people bring up amanitas. But I think muscarine is going to be one that people talk more and more about. I know you've been doing some research and stuff on that. So could you kind of fill us in on what's going on with muscarine and Amanita muscaria?
Yeah, I'll give you a little backstory on that. So, yeah, I created an alchemical elixir here where I decarboxylated the ibotenic to muscimol, and then it was verified in the lab. And then when the lab results came back, I was at a level of about 2-to-1 muscimol to muscarine. And we've never really paid much attention to muscarine before that because it was always thought that it's just, there in an insignificant amount, 0.003% or something. But for some reason, and whatever I developed, the levels were higher. And so now we had to look at it. And of course, if you do a quick Google cursory search, it's going to tell you it's a neurotoxin. And so it's like, oh, that's bad. And then when I actually looked into it, you find out that it's a direct muscarinic receptor in the parasympathetic nervous system, actually all throughout the body, central nervous system too. It's a direct activator of the receptors. And so, then if you go further into the research, you find out that there's an entourage with GABA and muscarine, acetylcholine. So it's just fascinating that you've got these naturally occurring neuroreceptor or neurotransmitters in nature that can have these effects. And then muscarine in the body has the effect of activating the rest and digest system, which counters fight or flight. So when you hear reports about, Amanita being anxiolytic and, reducing stress and depression, those sorts of things, it makes sense that you've got, GABA with its inhibitory activity, and then muscarine firing up your rest and digest to counter whatever, noradrenaline is produced in fight or flight, stress and anxiety. So those two together really hyper energize your your resting system. Um, so yeah, I was fascinated to find all this out.
Yeah, and anytime that I've like taken Amanita, especially at that sort of like very functional lower dose microdose range, there does seem to be this like, and part of a lot of this could be coming from the anxiolytic effect of it, but it just does seem to have this very potent nootropic like effect in terms of like word recall, flow state, shift. Because there's a real human phenomenon of whenever we sit down to work or to do some sort of different task, it can take our brain about like 45 minutes or something like that to shift into a different brainwave state and get into that flow state. But with Amanita, with Amanita reminds me a lot of the promises that have been made of typical serotonergic psychedelic microdosing. I don't know if you've ever gone down this rabbit hole, but I just saw a paper from like the Harvard something the other day in terms of the biggest double-blind uh, placebo-controlled study was done on microdosing serotonergic psychedelics, and they're pretty sure that the placebo control group had pretty much the same results as the people who received the sub-perceptual doses. And what I'm getting at here is that, and I've said this before on my accounts, that I feel like a part of the phenomenon with microdosing serotonergic psychedelics does have to do with placebo, and or people are actually taking themselves up above the sub perceptual threshold, like in terms of they are meeting that threshold of feeling something, which is like whatever sort of medicine you're using, if it's working for you, I think it's great. It's just, I think that there's been a bit of sensationalism around that a little bit. And then when I think of like my experience of Amanita and microdosing Amanita, it seems like all of those promises that were made of serotonergic psychedelics, in terms of like, first of all, I can interact with it every day. That's a big one, in terms of tolerance and things like that. Also, it does, there is a very tangible felt sort of quieting of the background noise, but it doesn't in any way sort of affect my lucidity in the moment. I'm very lucid and I'm very functional. I'm very present. So I don't know, man. Like, what is your personal experience been like with taking Amanita, and like what are some of the ways that you used it as a tool? You know.
Okay, got a lot to unpack there. So back to the serotonergics, we're seeing, there's a push for legalization or decriminalization, because we're so used to just focusing on that receptor, right? With SSRIs, like, oh, that's a problem. You don't have enough serotonin, right? So let's mess with the reuptake of it, So, well, if you're adding more psilocin, which is, almost chemically similar to serotonin, like, oh, that's like a given to them. But, the more you understand about all the different neurotransmitters in the brain and the functions of the different areas, then you see the magic of the GABA muscarine entourage. For example, recently I looked into a lot of research related to, there's a lot of anecdotal stories about helping with vivid dreams during REM, and I've certainly experienced that myself. In the shamanic traditions, it's very much about that, lucid dreaming. And so when you look into what's happening during REM, there's been research that's come out since about 2010. Professor Stickgold at Harvard psychiatry department, he actually was looking into eye movement desensitization recovery therapy for treating post-traumatic stress disorder, and he realized that this EMDR therapy actually used bilateral eye movement to release compounds in the brain. Well, those compounds end up being GABA and acetylcholine, and then he made the link that during REM, when you do memory consolidation and dealing with episodes in your life, those mechanisms, he said, those mechanisms are going to be powered by the GABA and the acetylcholine, and those are released during REM. So, and also during REM, you go into a more of a theta brain state, which to me is ideal for, like, the ultimate executive function. I think is more skewed towards theta, because that's the brain state we're in as kids when we're taking in all this information and learning languages and things like that. So I think those two, putting you in that state of theta executive function where you've got, you know, like a relaxed approach to, you know, like if you're in the business world, it's war out there, you know what I mean? So you can't be in fight or flight. You need to be in a calm, reasoned state to deal with a lot of things going on. And I think these two compounds in the mushroom are, you know, kind of the ultimate putting you in the zone or flow state or whatever term you want to apply to it. I'm finding that for myself. Um, in fact, I've got so much going on, you know, as we continue to put together the narrative on this mushroom that everybody wants to hate. So it's not an easy task. And I'm finding that the mushroom puts me in a state where I can handle, you know, the hurdles and obstacles that are coming my way as we try to get this out into the world. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to think of a term, you know, it's like the ultimate state of executive function is what I've determined is like super executive function or something. I'm going to come up with a phrase for it, right? But I really think it puts you in that the ultimate state of mind. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've felt that too. And I want to like, you know, the sleep thing is really big to me. I mean, I really enjoy and appreciate Amanita as a tool for daytime activities and sort of flow state and that executive function like you're describing. But one of the biggest sort of like cornerstones of people's health in general, it might be like the building block is your sleep, you know, and getting good quality, deep, restful sleep. And a lot of people struggle with that. And there's a lucrative fucking industry built around this sleep, you know, sleep supplements, different sleep biohack gadgets,
Pills,
and all
Ambien,
the sleep
etc. Right.
gurus and life
Mm-hmm.
pharmaceuticals, life coaches, the whole gambit, you know. And it's funny because I've walked a lot of that path in terms of like chronic insomnia is something that I've dealt with since I was a child. And it's a tough thing to live with, and I think a lot of people live with that. And there's all sorts of environmental factors and different reasons and genetics and things like that. But the important thing that I'm getting at here is that Amanita, I've tried everything under the sun. I've tried a lot of different supplements. And Amanita is like that one, man, where it's like, okay, it reliably like helps me fall asleep. Like in terms of like, I think it's sleep latency, like how fast it takes you to fall asleep. And then it
Right.
keeps me asleep. Like I'm not waking up to pee in the middle of the night 2 times. And then I wake up. Here's the really big thing for me too, man. I wake up feeling great, like truly rested. I don't feel groggy. And that's the big hurdle that I've faced with a lot of these different supplements, whether that be, you know, fucking pharma GABA or melatonin or whatever it is, you know, that grogginess when you wake up, there's like always a trade-off. But Amanita does seem to just feel very harmonious with my body. And then on top of like all these physiological things that I'm laying out right here, there is that sort of like very vividness, like the how vivid those dreams get is pretty crazy to me. Like that's another aspect of my life that it really added something to, because I didn't dream a lot in my life. And when I did dream, it wasn't super vivid or memorable. But since I started interacting with Amanitas, it's very vivid dreams that are somewhat insightful, it feels like. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think people really appreciate how important that sort of like the dreaming is, that state of REM sleep is for like emotional processing and memory, like your learning capabilities. And it's just, yeah, dude, it really is kind of magical.
Yeah, it is. And like, as you point out, you know, no side effects. I've had episodes where I had really bad insomnia and I was on Ambien and that was just a nightmare. And then, you know, one of the things about Ambien is you get the grogginess in the morning and then, you know, you can't take naps. Right. So that was really bad. And then I tried melatonin way back and same thing, just felt really groggy in the morning. But yeah, this is just a real clean, it's got a real clean effect. I think it's because these are, you know, direct neurotransmitting like compounds, you know, it's not like a synthesized uh, thing. Like, you know, you look at like the mechanisms of action, you look at like a gabapentin, which is an allosteric modulator at the neurotransmitter. So like they kind of treat it like it's the same thing as a GABA, but it certainly isn't. You know, then you got something like muscimol, which is going to work directly at the receptor level. So yeah, it's just a real clean feeling. And something else that came up the other day was I'm working with a gal here in town. She's turning all her yoga friends on to it and all very excited about it. But during the course of the conversation, we were saying, well, it helps you fall asleep. And like you said, it helps with sleep latency. But at the same time, you can take it during the day and it helps with focus and awareness. So it's like, well, it's kind of like, she goes, well, it's all about your intent. If you're taking it to go to sleep and have a good dream, like it'll do that. If you want to take it to have, super executive function during the day, it can do that too. You know what I mean? Like it's really mind blowing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And while it's so multifaceted and kind of like the Swiss Army knife like that, one thing that me and Christian talked about in our podcast, and I don't know if you've experienced this at all, but Christian kind of described it as like Amanita in her own way seems to be kind of like her own little gatekeeper in terms of like there is this sort of like a little bit of an adjustment period when you first start making it a regular part of your protocol. And sometimes that like if you've taken it with that intention of like I just want to get fucked up right now, it won't let you. That's not something I've personally experienced. That was something Christian echoed to me, this sort of like idea of Amanita being her own gatekeeper. And I think that sort of part of what he's alluding to there is just like the sort of what I said about it working in harmony with our body and just seeing to be like it's not taking people completely out of here, especially at that lower dose range. But
Yeah, yeah. You just made me think of something else I've been thinking about. So, back to, you know, the Harvard professor Stickgold and his research about these, he calls them algorithms that run, during REM, where you're doing memory consolidation, you're drawing disparate connections, and ultimately you're coming at them, continually forming a new modality where you can go forward the next day based on your experiences and how they were handled and how they could be handled differently in the future. You know what I mean? And so my thought is that these mechanisms, we know they run during REM, but during the day, I would suspect they're still running, just that maybe more of a subconscious level. You know what I mean? So if we can go out throughout the day where like these natural programs are running to help us deal with episodes like, like when you're in REM, you've got these like weird, like allegorical, metaphorical things happening and you don't understand it. Your subconscious does, right? And then during the day, I think, if you can stay in theta and you've got these compounds running that are like continuing to run the algorithms while you're going throughout your day, I think you're tapped into something we don't really fully understand that even exists in our waking life. These algorithms, that have been identified. So I think that's part of what's going on. You know what I mean?
yeah, it seems to come back to like that, just sort of like presence, that like mindfulness that it can bring you into. But I see what you're saying about that sort of like, yeah, you see the programs that are running.
I mentioned EMDR earlier, and part of
Yeah.
there's a protocol you use when you put people in this kind of REM-like state with bilateral stimulations. Part of the protocol is to get people to associate a painful experience that's been unresolved, stressful trauma, with a somatic sensation. Like, where does it make you, have a feeling or a pain or an anxiety or something? Pick a point in the body, right? And I've been realizing lately that for me, like when I'm going throughout the day, like if I feel all of a sudden I'm deluged with too many things on my plate where I just think I can't handle it all, in the past, pre-Amanita, I would get this thing in my gut, like my gut would be like, you just can't do it. And I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to take a nap or something because I can't deal. But with Amanita, I realized somatically, like that thing I would get in my gut that's like, you've got an insurmountable Sisyphean task ahead of you. That feeling is no longer there, And so I just,
Yeah.
you know, chop wood, carry water, I start just knocking things out. And it's just fascinating to me that it really allows me to just plow through the things I need to do without an overwhelming sense that it's not possible. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Absolutely. And as we like kind of have unpacked some of the, different receptor sites that it works on and just its overall effects, like it makes sense that it would provide you with that. And it provides me with that too. I think in general, it's going to be a very interesting to see how Amanita sort of synergizes with other people's practices and things, like in terms of mixing it with EMDR or some other type of therapy. One of the things that they allude to a lot with like MDMA therapy, and I'm not saying that I think Amanita tea is going to replace MDMA therapy or anything like that, but like, with MDMA therapy, one of the things that they allude to is that part of the reason why that is so efficacious for people is because these people who, like you said, that trauma is sort of stored in them, and they associate a certain like feeling with it in a way, with that like event, and it allows them to revisit it, but in a very safe way because of physiologically, what's going on up here and stuff with the MDMA. But I can see a world where, Amanita could mix with some traditional talk therapy like that as well, in terms of allowing people to revisit some of these traumas maybe in a slightly safer sort of container.
Yeah.
And not just that, but then also you think about, like, I know Yuri was talking to me, and people don't know Yuri's this, she facilitates plant medicine ceremonies and stuff. But she was talking to me about her using Amanita alongside psilocybin within her ceremonies and experiences. And I thought that was interesting, because then I was like, I've had experience with psilocybin, I've had experience with Amanita, I haven't combined the two. But I can see, just from having experiences with both those things and understanding them intimately, how they could synergize within that experience. So yeah, what has your experience been like synergizing Amanita with stuff, man?
Mm, well, I'm thinking with it, yeah, the psilocybin entourage, bring in the serotonin activity with the GABA and the acetylcholine. Yeah, I mean that's got some possibilities there. You would need to figure out some good ratios there. Like which system do you want to be dominant? The serotonergic system, GABA, cholinergic. You know, for me, like a psilocybin would be more about just like, to me, that's good for like enhancing, neural connections and lighting up the neuroplasticity and, creating new opportunities and ideas and places to go. So it could certainly have its place. Um, but, you know, I like, back to like you were saying about NMDA, like, we've got like, I got some friends going through like ketamine therapy, right, for depression now. And, I think the thing about ketamine is they are tapping into dissociation aspect, right, where you're further removed from those episodes. They're not so real, they're not so recent. And what I feel about Amanita is that it's got a built-in disassociation factor in the way that it calms and relaxes and keeps your fight or flight at bay. So when you are bringing these episodes up and really like digging into it, embracing it, like, all right, I'm going to try to deal with this again now in real time and try to like put it in its place once and for all in the past, and it kind of really helps you realize that these things happen in the past, and it's the past, it's not the now. You know what I mean? And like, wow, so Amanita really helps you focus on the now, and it really puts less emphasis on the past. It helps you realize that you know where you are now, you're feeling good in the now, and you're feeling good in the now because what's happened in the past had its place, had a purpose, had a function, and now you're here feeling good in the moment, and so it's all good. Let's just like not deal with that anymore, and like try to get rid of the whatever negative aspects still remain. So I think it's got a dissociative character built in. You know what I mean? So I think it really fits the bill for all
Yeah.
sorts of those trauma, depression therapies.
Yeah, absolutely. And that dissociation kind of being built in there like that, I think one of the things that people run up against sometimes, when it comes to maybe I'm projecting a bit here, but when it comes to like unpacking traumas and things like that, and I've witnessed this, it's like some people can become almost like identified with their traumas and their experiences that have shaped them, and like we've talked about, you can kind of store that, but by having that dissociation within that experience built in there, I think it sometimes allows people to disassociate also from that identity too that is, maybe perpetuating that. And once again, maybe that's a bit of a projection, but like dissociation to me in general is kind of interesting. Like the experiences that I've had with ketamine in the past, and even with Amanita, there's a good amount of the dissociation that can happen there as well. It's a very interesting headspace to me for sure that I think a lot of people can potentially benefit from. Um, but yeah, so
Everyone.
okay, man.
Yeah.
One thing I kind of wanted to, yeah, yeah. One thing I kind of wanted to unpack with you is, there's a lot of controversy around, and maybe controversy isn't the right word, but the history of Amanita and
Yeah.
its indigenous uses and its historical importance. There's books written on this shit. There's people who refute the books. I mean, have you looked into this and sort of like what is your opinion on how Amanita has been utilized by mankind and maybe even shaped culture and society a bit?
Well, here we go. Well, you notice my screen name is Rig Vedas, so we're gonna get into that now. Yeah. So when you look at there's all kinds of history around it. A lot of it's hidden in a metaphor and archetype and allegory, right? But when you look at I really started going down the rabbit hole with this when I was reading the R. Gordon Wasson book, Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, and where he makes the case that Amanita is the Soma of the Rig Veda, and the Rig Veda is the earliest known spiritual text, finally committed to print about 5,000 years ago in Sanskrit, but before that it had thousands of years of oral traditions, and where these tribes where the mushroom grows, which is typically in the northern latitudes, Siberia, that sort of area. He went through the Rig Veda, and like he would take passages from it, and they would talk about how, especially in the ninth mandala, which is the ninth chapter of the Rig Veda, they would talk about how Soma is the sun in the sun, or the son of God, and it's in the form of this red. Not they didn't say mushroom, they just said Soma, and they said they alluded to it being some form of a plant, something that grew, and so they claimed that they would use this beverage to. They would tell you how to prepare it in certain ways, and they would talk about how it's a metabolic process, like it changes in the body. So they knew, R. Gordon Wasson knew there was some metabolite being created. Now we've learned that that's the ibotenic being converted to the muscimol. And they would talk about, arriving in ecstatic states of bliss and, in oneness with the divine, and how it helped you navigate your rivers through the seven kingdoms, which are the seven chakras, free of grief, which would be, in a state of bliss and, lowered anxiety and stress, and how it would strengthen your single eye. Now, all these references are in the Rig Veda, and that book came out in '69. And R. Gordon Wasson was infamously the first Westerner to go to Mexico and participate in a psilocybin ceremony in the late '50s, and wrote a Time magazine article about it. So he was kind of like the top ethnomycologist of his day. And then he came out and said, "Hey, Soma looks like it's the Amanita Muscaria, because that's got the properties that we're discussing." And he would ingest it himself, and he's like, it seems to me this is what they were talking about. He made a very strong case for it, full of hundreds of cases of how the tribes use it in Siberia to achieve these states of consciousness. And then at the same time, interestingly enough, so that book came out in '69. In 1970, another book came out, John Allegro, and he was a very famous, the most famous and respected Dead Sea Scroll scholar. And he came out with a book in 1970 called The Mushroom and the Cross. And basically, he made the case that in his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he has determined that the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're talking about, this Jesus character, were actually code. Jesus was code for a mushroom, and that mushroom was Amanita Muscaria. So it's fascinating. Within 2 years, we had, the the Rig Veda, which ultimately led to, Hinduism and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the practices of yoga and meditation all started with this thing called Soma in the Rig Veda. So, that case was made in 69, and then 70, John Allegro came out and said, well, Christianity is based on the same thing. You know what I mean? And it's the same
Yeah.
mushroom. It's Amanita Muscaria. Then you've got in the Rig Veda, the mention of strengthening the single eye, the third eye. Of course, we see that in Hinduism. And then you've got in Matthew 6:22 in the New Testament, if your eye be single, your body will be full of light. So, everybody was kind of saying the same thing. And all roads point to it being Amanita Muscaria, putting you in this, spiritual state where you can, come to these realizations. So, yeah, of course, then we see it in the mythology. The shaman in Siberia, they dress in red and white, and we all know that they collect the mushrooms under the pine tree, the presents under the tree. They dry them over a fire in stockings. They come down the chimney of the yurt to deliver them, and they receive goodies from the locals. So, at some point, it seems like the dam bursts
Yeah.
open. I'll come to the realization that this is the one. This is the mushroom. This is the
Yeah.
fungi.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me too how prevalent it is in like just culture in general. Even like people who I can be introducing somebody to it in terms of like, hey, this is Amanita muscaria, like the little red top mushroom with the white dots, and people it lights up for them. It's like it's baked into most people's subconscious at the very least.
Super
Like they
Mario, the
recognize that
Smurfs,
mushroom. It's
right? Yeah.
Dude, it's everywhere. There's a new animated Netflix show that my son watches that is a little Amanita dude running around, and like it's not none of it's based on drugs or psychoactive substances or altered states of consciousness, but it's everywhere, and it seems like children, will draw it. If you ask them to draw a mushroom, they're likely to
Yeah,
draw Amanita muscaria.
with the dots.
It's and then it begs the question, is this in some way sort of built into our DNA? Because like epigenetics is really interesting to me, like the sort of things that we can inherit, like, just the physical sort of shape that you're in whenever you conceive your child is has a big part to play in how their sort of like genome turns out and stuff. And so you think about these sort of like several thousands and thousands of years that we were potentially consuming and interacting with some of these plants. But Amanita is one of those ones where it makes sense because it's like I mean, it's not everywhere, but it's in a lot of places around the globe, and it catches your eye. You know what I mean? It's one of those ones where even if you're not like looking for it and you see it, it's going to pull your eye to it. Um,
Oh yeah,
it
it's
just
unavoidable.
it makes sense, man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and back to the DNA. You look at the
yeah,
complexity of DNA. The amount of data that's stored there. The ancestral DNA, and for sure, it's somewhere in there. A connection to it from our ancient ancestors who undoubtedly had a relationship to it. Um, and then back to the history, I was want to add another point. So Gordon Wasson in his Soma book also mentioned that the tribes that came from the north, they brought their Soma technology down into the Indus Valley, and at those latitudes, Soma was not growing there, and they didn't know how to cultivate it. To this day, we can't cultivate it and domesticate it, so they lost access to it. And so it looks like they came up with like other ideas, like let's add ephedra and some other plants to try to recreate the Soma. And then ultimately, in around, when did yoga come out? About 600 AD, 6, 7, 800 AD, that practice started. So he makes a case in the Soma book that the Vedic culture and the practices of meditation and yoga ultimately were arrived at because they were trying to arrive at that state of meditative, ecstatic bliss, opening of the single eye with a physical practice. And they ultimately came up with meditation and breath work and yoga because they lost access to the Amanita Muscaria. So it was a way to try to, generate those processes in the body that could simulate that experience, So that's pretty fascinating. And then, so, recently I thought, well, a great way to kind of like, if you're asked to like on the spot, you got 10 seconds to describe Amanita Muscaria, I would say, it's meditation and yoga in a fungi. You know what I mean? When you do that big
Yeah.
story arc, you know what I mean?
Yeah, like there is a radical, I say radical, but there is a felt sort of shift in my experience of life after I come out of like a deep meditation or something like that. But the same thing, I want to say it's the exact same thing, but a very similar thing is felt too on Amanita. And once again, it comes back to this sort of flow state and mindfulness and everything that it puts us in. Um, but yeah, it's really I love seeing this sort of like reemergence of this thing, and it's not even like, hey, we just found out about this thing. It's like, hey, like, we're reintroducing this back to society in a way, but also like this has been a part of our society too for a very long time. Like this almost like a like mystery occultish, like, it's, and we're bringing it sort of back. And like, I don't know about you, man, but like um when I look at like the world that like I live in, like this planet and this time in history, it feels very funny, like almost like it's too much of a coincidence that we're here at this time. You know what I mean? It's a weird time to be alive, and a lot's coming. I feel like I don't know exactly what that is, but like, why do you think it is that? And maybe this is a bit of a loaded question. This can kind of get woo woo and esoteric, but like, why do you think it's like this time in history when Amanita is making this sort of reemergence?
It's the second coming. You know what I mean? The end of the world is near. We've been hearing that for, a few decades now. And, it's like, very, it feels very apocalyptic with everything happening, right? The wars and rumors of wars and natural disasters. And that's when the second coming happens, right? And Amanita's coming back. You know what I mean? And,
Yeah.
we're the apostles and the prophets bringing it back. You know what I mean? No, it's so fascinating.
I love.
It blows my mind.
Yeah. Dude, I'm with you, brother. Like when I tell people about it too, and I really like when they're receptive and I get time to fully explain it and thing and all of that stuff, dude, it's crazy. Like we've talked about this. You see the switch go off in people's head and they're like, oh, like, aha. Like it's so, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's misinformation or just kind of like the cultural significance of the war on drugs in general and how that's kind of conditioned people to think about these things. But people understand it. They just like it's whenever it's explained to them, in sort of like regular terms and honestly, and they're given the full picture. People see it, and I love how you laid out all of this shit about Christianity, early Christianity, and the Rig Vedas and Hinduism and Amanita, and then you're like, it's the second coming. It's the second coming of Jesus Christ. It really
It
might
is.
be, dude. Like in terms of yeah, like when I see and talk to people who like it's helped, and just even my own felt experience with it, it's like, oh, I get it. I can see how this would be super super beneficial for a lot of people. But
Oh yeah. Well. It works miracles, right? Let's get into the inspiration for doing this podcast today. Anyway, I put together a little piece on Jesus, the Amanita Muscaria, and the miracles performed, and how we're seeing that the benefits of Amanita are being borne out when you look at these miracles in the New Testament. Um, and what got me thinking about it was, again, back to my friend who's caretaking this Parkinson's sufferer, and how Amanita is ceasing tremors. What we're seeing is a small dose of what I've developed here, the muscarine and muscimol, will eliminate tremors for 48 hours, for up to 48 hours, and then it helps him walk. So then that got me thinking about having grown up in the church, about, back to the, John Allegro, Jesus was the Amanita Muscaria. And I thought, well, oh, wait, let's go back to the New Testament and let's see what miracles Jesus, aka Amanita Muscaria, was doing, and see how that's being borne out and what we're seeing now with the effects of it. And again, mind blown. Um, In one of the miracles, Jesus cured, I think it was a Roman centurion's son of palsy. Well, you look at the definition of palsy from the Greek, and it's tremors, and I'm seeing that firsthand. Mind blown, right? And then how Jesus cured leprosy. Well, we're seeing, scientific evidence around muscimol and its effects on skin conditions. It's an anti-inflammatory. They've done experiments with wounds in rats where it heals the healing process on a wound on the skin, right? So, okay, check that box. Um, Jesus calmed the boat in the storm and calm the seas. Well, we know it's got a calming effect, right? So that's more metaphorical. Of course, Jesus caused the blind to see. Back to Matthew 6, it opens your single eye, helps the blind, the spiritually blind, to see. And then back to some of the science research, I've ultimately discovered that we've got muscarinic receptors in the pineal gland that could be activated by Amanita Muscaria. So there's the physiological link, right? So, wow.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. No,
and he
I
helped.
mean,
One
super
more miracle was
interesting.
he. Well, back to the miracles too. Another miracle was he helped someone to walk again, right? Well, I'm helping that with again my Parkinson's friend who has trouble walking, so it helps him walk and lessens tremors. So you know, let's look to the past
Yeah.
to see what the future holds for this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and if you really read the Bible from like I guess a grown up perspective in a way. Like at the core of it, it is like a sort of magical book in terms of it seems like there's a lot of just like magic baked into that thing, and we're talking about a magical mushroom here, and and if you think about it, I mean the Bible's been rewritten and translated like how many times, and then also information has like with it's sort of like the imperialism that they've dealt with over several cycles. It makes sense that some of it was shrouded in code words and sort of
Right.
stuff like that. I've heard those theories proposed. So yeah, it really wouldn't surprise me if Amanita was it. I also heard. Have you ever read the book? It's like the secret psychedelic, secret history of the religion with no name, the immortality key. Have you ever read that?
Yeah. Mm-mm. No,
It
I have
was
not.
it was an interesting book. This lawyer, he was a lawyer. He's still a lawyer, but he spent like 20 years researching and writing this book, looking into the sort of like mysteries at Eleusis in ancient Greece and that sort of cult that was around that. And he ties it to like basically these psychedelic mystery cults of ancient times and theorizes they were using ergot fungus. And then at one point in the book, ergot fungus because it contains LSA and different sort of alchemical brews like that. And they even have chalices that they've done, samples on and found LSA in. But if further on in the book, he theorizes that part of the misinterpretation of Jesus was linked to this as well, in terms of just psychedelics in general, and the use of some of these early primitive. I say primitive. Some of these older um, plant medicines and stuff that were around back then. I don't know if it refers to Jesus as actually being a being who distributed this knowledge and these substances, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I and then I've also heard theories. I've also heard theories of Jesus being like a yogi and different things like that. It to me like most religion, and this gets back to what you were describing earlier about like, all right, first they had Amanita, or first they had Soma, and then yoga was developed. It wouldn't surprise me if most, if not all, religions had their sort of beginnings in an altered state of consciousness, um, like through these different modalities. And one debate we had on a podcast one time, one of our like psych tubers panel discussion things, we had this debate. And this was just a small part of the debate, but the question was asked like, okay, would people have even really sought after these altered state of consciousness through yoga, meditation, whatever it is, if they didn't have the sort of preliminary primary experiences with plant medicines. And I don't know the answer to that question. It's kind of like the
Well,
chicken
it
and the
sounds,
egg, but
yeah, they knew it was possible and they lost access to that method.
yeah.
So, like, well, let's keep trying to get there in whatever way we can, right? So then they kind of finally nailed it, right? It's kind of like, yeah, the perception that it's possible has to be there first, right? Like, I love to use the example of the 4 minute mile. Do you know that story about the 4 minute mile
No,
historically?
no.
Well, for, I don't know, throughout all history, it was thought that no one could ever run a mile in under 4 minutes. So no one ever broke the 4 minute barrier until one guy finally did it. Then as soon as they saw it was possible, then everybody started doing it. You know what I mean? So you need to like
Yeah.
have that light turned on, and then like, well, how do I get there? You know what I mean? Yeah. So for sure, it was preceded by
Yeah.
knowing that it was possible. Knowing that it was possible. Yeah. 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 Well, and back to
Absolutely.
your
Absolutely.
mention of ergot in the Bible. So in the Bible, it looks like there's a lot of theory around the manna of the Bible being ergot, and where they receive certain states of consciousness, right? And then of course Moses encountered the burning bush, and there's the whole theory that that was some kind of a DMT experience, right? Um, and then there's mention of, I think, sweet cane in the Bible. That's probably cannabis. You know what I mean? And of course we have frankincense and myrrh and various other, sorts of things from the plant kingdom involved in these rituals.
And those chalices that they tested, I'm pretty sure cannabis was involved in that. There was a few. It was an interesting mixture of things. It was like cannabis. It was some other herb. Like it was some sort of sage. Then there was like datura in there as well. Like certain datura alkaloids were found, and it was so. I think for a long time, human beings have been kind of experimenting, even this in this day and age, with all this access we have to various substances and information and things. People still go out on a whim and test new combinations and try different synergies of things and stuff like that. You
Yeah.
know, but
Are you very familiar with
yeah,
Terence McKenna's work,
yeah, yeah,
his stoned
absolutely,
ape theory? He attributes that to, we were like competing for different food sources, and that got the apes in the trees to stumble upon psilocybin as the one that ultimately caused them to have consciousness. I don't agree with everything he said, but it's it's like he alludes to the fact that we look to the plant fungi kingdom as a way to elevate consciousness from the very beginning, right? And I would
yeah.
propose that, well, that mushroom was Amanita Muscaria.
Yeah, I was gonna say it also could have been some sort of combination. And when you think, I really love that theory. That's a like OG sort of like psychedelic theory right there. And I've
Yeah.
heard like people refute it and things. But what's I think that the idea of like literal monkey humanoid beings eating mushrooms and evolving is amazing, and it wouldn't surprise me if that did have some effect. But then like you also think about like early civilization, like early agriculture civilization. Like we're just kind of like settling and figuring this out and figuring out how we like delegate and specialize and what all those different things, right? It I can see how psychedelic ceremonies and interacting with these things could have had a huge like part to play in shaping just human culture and how we interact with one another. And yeah, and then I know Terence McKenna within that, one of the things he talks about is the sort of like he theorizes that there was this thing that happened where it was we moved away from like being mushroom societies into being like alcohol societies. You hear about this, and it's like one
Well,
of the things that we would do is with these. Go ahead.
what was it's not an evolution. It was social engineering. I think, right? Like they wanted to take us away from these consciousness evolving substances and give us something that dulls the mind, right? So, and you look back to the Wasson book, he talks about how the Russians introduced alcohol into these Amanita Muscaria tribes, And then they ultimately would then form an affinity with alcohol over the Amanita. And some of these people in these tribes they'd be all about the abotanic effects. They'd be all in abotanic, and they love stumbling around drunk and the feeling of disassociation it gave them. And then you would fall asleep and then awake to the other effects. But so then it was a deliberate attempt by the powers that be in Russia at the time to come into these tribes and replace that with alcohol. And ultimately we see that everywhere, right? The drug of choice by the people that run the show. you know.
Absolutely, and that's another thing that drives me a bit crazy is that there's this barrier that we've talked about with other people of like the misinformation that's been spread, and this thing that's been like a lot of people, their association with Amanita and why they've never explored it or looked further into it is because their entire association with it is that it's toxic or poisonous, and it's like that's, as me and you both know, that's sort of an oversimplification and misrepresentation of what this thing actually is. But okay, if we want to talk about toxicity, it's like, there's all sorts of things that we interact with quite regularly that are, just as toxic, if not insanely more toxic. Like alcohol is a perfect example. If we don't cook our meat for long enough, like that can kill us. Like there's all sorts of things like this. And so this idea that, that's one thing that I really try and like drill through people's head when I get to talking to them about this. Is like, hey, it's not this thing to like be afraid of. Like, of course you want to be educated, and if you're going to take a large dose, you do want to prepare it. Most people prefer to prepare it and decarboxylate it, but it's not this fucking scary, bad, don't touch it thing.
Well, you know, words create worlds. And I'm glad we arrived here. I didn't even think about this, but yeah, we need to talk about this because back to alcohol. What do they call it when you drink too much? Intoxication, right? So you know you've got to look at the Paracelsian axiom where everything is toxic. It's dose dependent, right? So like you can even have too much water, right? So you really need to apply that Paracelsian axiom. And when you look at a foraging guide, it's going to say Amanita muscaria is toxic. Well, that's an unscientific term. Like it's dose dependent. How much abotanic is going to be toxic? Cause toxic effects. Um, so, and we need to look at our terminology, and they use this terminology to weaponize these things where you can like label something toxic and nobody wants to look at it, even though it's a medicine. You look at the side effects of big pharma, that's toxicity. Um, so, as in terms of like people wanting to embrace these compounds and experiment with them, I think we need to think about, homeostasis. We've got, a place where like everything's just kind of like, steady state, status quo. I feel fine, but I want to enhance something. I want to enhance a feeling. I want to enhance my ability to learn a new language or remember things, or I want to increase my executive function. And then, so we go to Starbucks, right? We think caffeine's going to be the one. But, so I think just the way our bodies are is that we've got a point of homeostasis and we've got like margins to play with that, right? And I think we can introduce these entheogenic compounds and neurotransmitters in Amanita, and we can play with, well, what happens if I excite my parasympathetic nervous system at the same time as I'm activating more GABA receptors? You know what I mean? What does that feel like? Oh, it feels like theta brain state with, relaxed focus. Okay. And I can arrive at that with a microdose. There's no toxicity involved, right?